Hello students. Today's video is about the color wheel. Now the purpose of the color wheel is to teach you about the relationships of the 12 basic colors, including how each color is mixed using paint, and to help you identify similarities and differences between colors which can help you to make decisions about color use in your artwork. The process of creating a color wheel will also teach you strategies about mixing paint in general, as well as craftsmanship strategies for conserving paint and properly applying it to a surface for an even and precise and consistent appearance. So before you, I have a blank template of a color wheel. I have a can of water. I have my 5 paint colors. I have a paper towel, brushes, and a pad of palette paper. So I'm going to explain how we're going to use each of those things, and we'll get to each one in just a moment. But first we'll start talking about the color wheel sheet so that you know what to look for and how we're going to approach this. So if you look around the circle of the wheel, there is a list of the colors and even the order in which you should paint those colors going around the wheel. And we'll talk about why you're doing this in a certain order when we get started here shortly. But you can see that each color is labeled and numbered to tell you which one to do in which order as you work your way around the color wheel. In addition, there are some tips and tricks and just general things that may help when working with this. All of these things, of course, will be covered in the expectations that will be presented to you online. So let's get started. So first of all, like I said, we've got water. We're going to use that to wash out our brushes later on, but we don't need to worry about that just yet. Then we have 5 different paint bottles. So I've got the 3 primary colors, which is red, yellow, and blue. And then I have 2 values of paint, black and white. I have a paper towel, which of course will be used to dry my brush after washing it out. This is important because you always want to work with a dry brush when it comes to this type of paint, which is acrylic paint. Not all paints are like that, but when it comes to working with acrylic, you always want to be working with a dry brush, because if you add water to the paint, it thins the paint and affects its appearance. So we don't want that, so we're always going to be working with a dry brush. Then we have palette paper. This is what we're going to use in order to mix our paints so that we don't mess up anything that's in these bottles. We want these bottles to remain pure and not get other colors inside them, so having this palette paper is going to help with that. Last thing is the brushes. Now, each of you will be provided a set of 6 different brushes of various types. And there are 3 round bristled brushes and 3 flat brushes. That just has to do with the shape of the brush itself. A flat brush is been pressed flat on the metal ferrule at the end of the brush, resulting in a flattened blade-like shape. The end of the brush is also flat angled so that it has a flat edge on this side as well as when facing at an angle like this. Round brushes are round because the metal ferrule is round and the bristles are not pressed flat, and generally a round brush will form a sharp pointed tip at the end. So when using a round brush is all about details and about blending. Now, we're not going to be doing any blending on their color wheel, so you won't need these brushes for this. Now, we're going to be painting this with a flat brush, but we don't need the biggest one because that may be a little too big for this smaller area that we're working with. So I'm going to set that aside as well. We also don't want the small one. That's just a bit too small. So the one that we're looking for to use on the color wheel is going to be the one that has the number 8. So the 8 flat brush is what we're going to use to complete this color wheel. Now, the first step in this process is to get some paint out on your palette paper so that you can mix it. So I've got my bottles here. I'm not going to get all 5 of these out because I won't be needing the black and white for a while. So I'm going to set those aside for now and just focus on the 3 primary colors. So one thing to understand about acrylic paint is that it goes a long way. Now, Each of you are being provided a 4-ounce bottle of paint. Now that's plenty of paint to work with, assuming you don't waste it, which means getting too much paint at any given time. You can always put more paint on the palette paper if your paint runs out. But once it's on the palette paper, there's no putting it back in the bottle. So be conservative with the amount of paint that you use to ensure that you don't use too much at any given time. I promise it goes a long way, so you have to be very careful about how much paint you put down, or you'll end up throwing away a lot of it. And you'll see that by the time I get done. Even if I put down just a small amount, there's going to be paint that goes to waste. So, as a general rule, okay, so I've got my cap of paint. I'm going to turn this up, and what I want is about a dime-sized amount of paint. So I want you to look at how big that pile of paint is. That will go a long way. Like I said, I should be able to do most of the color wheel with that. If it ends up that I need more paint, I can always add more, but that is plenty, and it will be more than enough to complete such a small thing as a color wheel. So I want to get the same amount of paint in each of the 3 colors. And notice that I'm spacing them out on here. That's because I need room to work around and mix these colors, so I don't want to get them too close together so that I have room to breathe, so to speak. Okay, so I've got my 3 starting colors, and that's, like I said, all I need right now, but if I end up needing more paint, I can always come back and get more. Okay, so I've got my color wheel template. I've got my paint set out over here, so now it's time to get started. So if I look at the color wheel, I can see that number 1, the first color that I start with is yellow. Now the reason why we are starting with yellow is because, as a general rule of thumb when it comes to mixing colors and painting, is that you always want to work from light to dark. This is because it's the right way based on this type of paint in order to get the best results when you paint, because these colors are semi-transparent. So if you put dark colors down and then add light over the top, the tendency will be for only the dark color to show through. And so you always want to work with light colors first and gradually work your way up to dark colors, and you'll conserve a lot of paint that way, especially when working with the primaries by themselves, because you can make the colors a bit more solid by mixing in white or mixing in black. But for the color wheel, we don't want to do that. So we're starting with yellow because between the 3 primary colors, it is the lightest of the 3. So like I said, we're always going to work from light to dark, so that's what we're going to start with. So what I'm going to do is I want to load the brush up with paint. Now, there's a couple of mistakes that can be made here. One is getting way too much paint on the brush and getting a big dripping glob of paint on there. I don't want that. But I also don't want a tiny little bit of paint like this, okay? What I put on here is not going to be nearly enough to cover this surface. So as a general rule of thumb, whenever you're mixing your paints and loading up your paintbrush, you always want enough to complete the entire section of the color wheel without having to go back and forth between the paint. And that is simply not enough paint. So what I actually want is I want the brush to be loaded up fairly heavily like this. Now I also want to brush flat against the palette paper because it helps to shape the blade of this flat brush into a nice flat shape, which is going to give me better results and make it easier to control and stay within the lines. Because when I grade this, it won't be just how well you mix the colors, it's also how neat you paint and trying to stay within the lines, because I'm teaching you about both mixing colors and controlling the paintbrush. And so I want you to try to stay within the lines as best as you can. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it shouldn't be sloppy. So I'm going to start here, and the best way to do this is when you paint, you always want to paint with the blade flat like this, not turned up on its side like this, okay? So always keep it flat like this. The next thing is you want to brush this direction, not side to side. So I'm keeping the brush flat because it's going to be easier to control the edge of where my paint ends and stay right along this black line by keeping my brush oriented in this direction. So always keep it flat like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the very end as close as I can get to the end here, and then I'm going to drag the brush continuously without stopping until I get to the end. The reason why it's important that you do this continuously without stopping, because every time you stop, especially with darker colors, you're going to see streaks and unevenness and brush strokes. And we don't want that. The goal is to make this flat and smooth and even. And so in order to do that, once you put the paintbrush to the paper, you need to keep moving without stopping. Every time you stop, it creates imperfections in the surface. You also don't want to necessarily start anywhere in the middle of the paint, but instead start at the end and go all the way to the end. Now you can see I missed a few spots down here, so I'm going to go along this because it's easier to get this edge going this direction than it is brushing into it from this direction, okay? So now you can see that was fairly easy and straightforward. I've got this yellow area filled in completely. That's done, okay? So now I'm going to be moving on to the next color. So next color here, number 2, is yellow-green, which is a tertiary color. So it's tertiary because it's talking about the relationships between colors. Because it's tertiary, that just means that the two colors that it's mixed with, which will be yellow and blue, it's going to be more visually similar to yellow than it is to blue. If it were equal in appearance between yellow and blue, then it would be a secondary color, which would be green. But we're not starting there because we want to go in order from light to dark. So the lightest color is going to be yellow-green because between the mix of yellow and blue, blue is darker. So any color that favors blue more than yellow is automatically going to be darker down here, okay? So we're going to start with yellow-green. Now, in order to mix colors properly, this is where you have to be very careful. What you have to understand is that when it comes to mixing paints, the light color is always needed to be much heavier than the dark color. That's because the dark color strongly overpowers light color. So it's not an equal mix of both colors. So you can see I've picked up a big glob of yellow. Now I don't want to mix it here because I want to leave my yellow alone because I'll need it again for mixing orange. So instead, I'm going to make a new pile over here between yellow and blue. And I'm going to take about half of the remaining yellow because I'll need the other half for orange, so I want to leave some of that alone, but I want plenty of paint to work with. So you can see there's a lot of paint here. So now I've got lots and lots of yellow. Now, like I said, dark colors overpower light colors to an extreme degree. The darker the color, the more that overpowering happens. So between yellow and blue, you can see that blue is much, much darker than yellow. So if I use too much blue, it's going to change the color too much. My goal is yellow-green. Think of it sort of like a pale lime green color. So in order to get that, I need very little blue. So you can see this little sliver of blue that's kind of come out of there right there. That is probably more than enough. I'm just going to grab that up, okay, and get that on my brush, and then I'm going to mix it in with the yellow. Now look what happened. Just that tiny little bit of blue compared to all that yellow, and look how rapidly that color has changed. It barely took any, and it's already darkened up quite considerably, okay? So that's completely normal, and so you have to be very careful not to add too much of the dark color, because if you overshoot it, then you're going to have to add a lot of the light color into it in order to fix it. So it won't take just a small amount to get this lighter. I'd have to add a significant portion of what's left in order to make this much lighter. But what I have here is what I'm looking for, okay? Yellow-green. It may seem a little dark, but you're going to see that when the paint is piled up on the palette paper, it tends to look a little bit darker than when you actually apply it to the paper. So you'll see that it's going to end up looking lighter when I get it on here. Also understand that there's not one specific way that this color has to look. It can be a little lighter or darker as long as the amount of change is consistent and even and not too much or too little between colors, then you're good, okay? So I'm going to start with yellow-green, and I'm going to do it the exact same way that I did yellow, which is to start at the end and move continuously without stopping until I get to the other side. And then I'm going to start at the beginning again and go back over it, and I'm going to go consistent with my direction. I don't want to sketch this in. What I mean is like staggering back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, because what will happen if I do that is it's going to look textured and uneven, and I don't want it to look textured and uneven. My goal is flat, even values. Now you can see it's a little uneven right now, but I'm not finished. I'm going to keep brushing over it continuously until I feel like it has evened out. Okay, so that's good. That's what I want. That's exactly what yellow-green should look like. It's nice and light. It's smooth and even. There's no clumps or globs of paint anywhere, so I'm good here. I don't have to add any more layers. I don't need to do anything else. And I definitely don't want to overwork it by continuing to add more and more paint, because the more paint you add to a piece of paper like this, the more moisture that the paper absorbs. And once it starts really absorbing moisture, it can affect the appearance of your colors. And so if you're not careful, it's going to cause you problems. If you notice that your paper is starting to look strange and uneven and you can't get it to brush on properly, it's probably because there's too much moisture in the paper. You need to wait. Let your paint dry and then do a second coat, and that can help even it out if that happens, okay? So, like I said, I'm good here on yellow-green. So the next color in the sequence is green. You notice that there are 3 shades of green in between each primary. So we've got the primary yellow, we've got primary blue. And by the way, primary colors, they're called that because when we talk about these 3 primary colors, yellow, blue, and red, these are the most basic of the colors. There's no way to create yellow using any other combinations of paint. Same thing with blue, same thing with red. But the great thing about the primary colors is that depending upon how you combine them and mix them together, you can get any color imaginable, sometimes with combinations of black and white as well. But every color imaginable can be created from just these 3 primaries, okay? And so that's what we're trying to illustrate here, is how you can mix to get a broader range of colors. So like I said, yellow and blue mixed together creates greens. And the more yellow you have, the lighter the green. The more blue you have, the darker the green. So that's what we've got going here, is we've got yellow-green. So the next one we do is regular green, okay? So in order to get regular green, your instincts might tell you, well, it's halfway between yellow and blue, so therefore I need 50% yellow, 50% blue. If you do that, the color that results will be significantly darker than it should appear. You want your colors to be visually halfway between yellow and blue, but not physically mixing equal portions of paint. If you took 1 cup of blue and 1 cup of yellow and mixed it together, you would get a very, very dark blue-green color. That's because, like I said, the darkest of the 2 colors will always overpower. So it's always going to take much less blue than it's going to take yellow when it comes to mixing your greens. So I've got my yellow-green here, and so I've got plenty of this left over, so that's a good thing, because now all I have to do is just add a little bit more blue to it. Again, look at how little paint I've added to my brush. Just a tiny little speck at the end, okay? But again, stirring that in is going to make a big impact in the way this color appears. So once I've stirred that up, I can see that that color is already quite a bit darker than what it was before. Now, is it perfect? I'm not sure. I could maybe go just a hair darker, but I'm pretty fond of that color. But I'm just going to get just a tiny little bit more. Again, very small amount, mix it in. Just to get a little bit darker, just to push a little bit more difference between it and yellow-green. Okay. Now, notice that when I'm mixing my colors, I'm also mixing them up very thoroughly. What you don't want is you don't want streaks of yellow and blue mixed into this green color. You want it to be completely and entirely mixed together, both on the palette and on your brush. So if you see little spots of yellow or anything like that on your brush, it could potentially get onto your color wheel. So it's important that you keep mixing your colors until it is completely homogenized, meaning that everything looks the same. Perfectly blended. Okay, so that's good. That's what we want. Now look at how much paint is loaded up on the brush. Same thing here. You want enough that you can complete this entire green without having to go back in here. So if you're doing yours and you get halfway through green and you run out of paint and you have to go back over here and pick up some more, you're not getting enough paint on your brush. So please remember that you want plenty of paint on your brush as you go so that you can do these colors all at once. The reason for that is because if you don't have enough paint and you try spreading it out across this surface, it starts to dry out while you're painting. And when it dries out, it starts to get streaky and uneven. And you don't want that. You want it to be flat and smooth like these first 2 colors. And the only way to ensure that that happens is have plenty of paint on your brush. All right, so there we have green. So the last one in this sequence is blue-green. and that's what's going to come next. So I've, again, got plenty of green left over here, so all I have to do is add more blue. But now that I'm getting into the darker end of the spectrum, now I can be a little bit more generous with my blue because I want the color to change more dramatically to get to this darker green. So here I've gotten a bigger bit, but still nowhere in comparison to the amount of green that I have. Okay, so we've got that mixed up right there. You can see that's a nice blue-green color. Could be a little darker. And again, there's no one set way that these colors need to look as long as they're different enough from the previous colors. So if you mix your paint and you feel like it's not different enough, or if it's too different, then you just need to make adjustments to that color by continuing to mix. Remember that if you go too dark and you have to lighten, it takes a whole lot more of the lighter color to fix that. So if I went too dark with this, I would end up having to add in most of this yellow in order to correct it, because just a small little scoop like I was showing you with the blue will have very little or no impact on this color when going from darker to light. Okay, so now I've finished my greens. I've got yellow, then I've got yellow-green, then I've got green, then I've got blue-green. The next color up in the sequence is blue. But one thing that you've noticed that I haven't done up to this point is I haven't washed my brush. That's because if I wash my brush and remix these colors every single time, I'd end up wasting a lot of paint throwing it out in the water. There was no need to wash my brush because all I was doing was taking the green that I had and just adding more pigment to it, adding more blue to get that color darker. And so there's no reason to wash my brush out. But now the thing that I need is I need blue with no green. And so no matter how much blue I add to my brush, there's always going to be a little bit of green left in it. And so it'll never be truly blue if I keep that green in there. So that's why it's important whenever you are eliminating a color from the mix. So in this case, I'm eliminating yellow from the mix and resulting in just blue. This is where I need to wash my brush out. So if you're changing your primaries, you wash your brush. So when washing your brush, you can see that this can has a texture on the side of it. And if you're using an old can, which by the way, if you're working from home, just an old soup can or can of beans or whatever that you're going to normally throw away makes for an excellent water can, because this texture on the side is just a good surface to sort of rub your brush against while you run it through the water. You can kind of just circle it through the water and run it up against the side and just try to knock as much of that loose paint off of the brush as you can. Then pull it out and look and see. I still have a little paint here, so I just get to keep working just a little bit more, try to get that off as much as I can. All right, so I've got the majority of it. There may be a little bit at the very end, but I'm going to be able to wipe that off with a paper towel. So what you want is, one, to just knock off the excess water that you can, and then get your paper towel. Now, what you don't want to do is you don't want to just jam your bristles into the paper towel, because you want to maintain this nice flat shape. And if you jam your bristles into the brush like that to dry it out, it's going to cause your bristles to be all splayed out and spread apart, and you don't want that. So instead, the best way to do it is to lay the brush flat on the paper towel like this, squeeze your hand over it, and just kind of twist and sort of pull it out. And just keep doing that a few times. And your goal is you don't want to see any color on your paper towel from the brush. So I can see a little bit of green left in there, so I'm going to do this again just to make sure, just wash it a second time, make sure I get every ounce of that green paint out of there. So now that the water is coming out clear, that's a sign that I have got my brush clean enough. Now, I want to make sure that my brush is completely dry. So you can see I'm pinching it between the paper towel and I'm just kind of pulling it through it until it comes back dry. So I can tell that it's dry by just feeling the bristles and making sure there's no, if I squeeze them, that no water dripping off. It can be slightly damp and that's okay, but it shouldn't feel wet. All right, so now I'm ready for blue. Okay, so notice that after blue, which is labeled number 5, is blue-violet, which is not labeled number 6. It's labeled number 12. That's because I can't keep going this direction. You see, blue is the darkest of the 3 primary colors. And so Can't go any darker than blue. So if I'm starting with blue, then I'm automatically going to be trying to go lighter with any color on the color wheel. So by doing blue-violet next, I will be working from dark to light. And I don't want to work from dark to light. Just like this, I want to go light to dark. So instead of starting here, I'm going to come back to that later. So just understand, when you're doing the color wheel, you can't do this in one continuous direction like you're trying to start somewhere and go clockwise all the way around. Doesn't work that way, because you're going to have to jump around in order to do this the right way, which is to work from always light to dark. Okay, so the next color I'm going to be doing is yellow-orange. So right now I've got all this blue on my brush, so I need to wash my brush out again. All right, so the next, like I said, is the sequence of oranges. Yellow-orange being closer to yellow than it is to red, which is why it's called yellow-orange. Then orange after that, and then red-orange. Red-orange being called red-orange because it's more similar to red than it is to yellow. So that's also because red is darker than yellow, is going to be the correct order of light to dark going across here. So I'm going to go ahead and complete all three of these colors the same way I did the greens. Then we will go from there. So, you notice I was about to paint and then I stopped, all right? The reason why I did that is because I noticed, unfortunately, I didn't do a good enough job cleaning my brush out. And so as a result, there was a little bit of green left on my brush. Now, if you mix green with orange, you're gonna get a muddy brown color. So this color isn't right because it has a small trace amount of blue in there as well. And I don't want blue in my orange. So you have to be careful. If you notice that you didn't clean your brush out properly, then you have to start over. Don't put it on here. Once it's on here, it's messed up and you may end up having to start over. As long as you notice any problems like that before you apply it, you should be fine. So I didn't put it down because I was worried that color was had too much green in it. So now my brush is good and clean. I don't see any trace of that green, so I think I should be okay to proceed. So I don't want to use this color now here, this yellow-orange. It's pretty much ruined because of the green that's mixed in there. So I'm not going to use that. I still got plenty of yellow left. I'm just going to take the rest of these yellow. In fact, I'm just going to mix it here because I won't need yellow again after I do orange. So I'm just going to try this again, this time without any green in my brush. Okay, that looks much better. So now I'm going to go ahead and apply this over here on the yellow-orange section. Okay, so now we have yellow-orange, now regular orange. Okay, so I've got regular orange, now for red-orange. Okay, now we've got red-orange. Now, the next color in the sequence is red. So just like before, I have to wash my brush out. I got to get rid of all the yellow out of this paint so that I only have red on the brush. You may notice that red has a slightly pink appearance. That's because the red that you're using is actually magenta. Magenta, it does favor a bit of pink, especially when it's first being applied. It does darken up to more of a true red color. But the reason why we use that is because magenta is much better for mixing and getting a wide color variety with other colors versus a true red. So magenta is just a better mixing color. All right, so next up after red is red-violet, followed by violet, followed by blue-violet. Now, just like before, we're going to create them in sequence from lightest to darkest. So you're going to start with red-violet, then blue-violet. Now, here's the thing that I want to warn you about when it comes to doing the violets. The thing about the violets is that both red and blue are dark colors. And you will find that if you are not extremely careful with how much blue you mix in, you will find that it gets way too dark way too quickly, and it makes it very difficult to get a good range of values on all three of these colors. So Definitely the violets are the most difficult of the colors on the color wheel to get right. So be very careful and pay attention to the colors that I apply so that you get a sense of what these colors should look like. The main thing is use lots of red, because the more red that you use, the easier it is to control the blue, because again, that blue is very overpowering. Look how little blue I have on my brush here, okay? It doesn't take much at all. Look how much red's on there. Look how much red's on my paper. Okay, red, violet. Now on to violet. And finally, blue violet. Okay, there we go. We've got a nice, dark, rich blue-violet color. So that completes the main part of the color wheel, with one exception, which is the warm neutral tone, or brown, in the center. So this will show you how to mix a neutral color. So the idea when you're mixing a neutral color is it's going to combine all three primaries. Basically, what you're going to do technically, if you want a brown color, is you mix two complementary colors. These are colors that are opposite one another on the color wheel. So I could mix red and green and get brown. I can mix blue and orange and get brown. I can mix violet and yellow and get brown. So I'm aiming for a warm neutral tone, which is a brown. A cool neutral tone would be a gray. So I want it to be warm, and in order to make it look warm, it needs to be a brown shade. So since I've already got this violet here, like I said, I can make it with any of this, because it's just, technically, it's just mixing all three primaries. So I've got all this extra yellow-orange that I was unable to use. So I'm just going to go ahead and use it now and create a color. So right now, a little muddy, a little dark, kind of green in appearance a little bit. Not quite the color I was aiming for, all right? But I can fix that, because what you can do is, if it looks too much like a certain color, so in this case it looks a little kind of like muddy green. So if it looks too green, add more of its complement. So it's looking too green, add more red. And there we have it. Look at that nice chocolate brown color. That's what I want. Okay, so I want a nice chocolate brown. Mix it up real good. And apply that to the circle in the center. Just like everywhere else, paint carefully. Try to stay within the lines. Takes a little bit of extra care to paint around a rounded edge, but just do your best to stay within those lines. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it shouldn't look messy. Okay, there we have the completed color wheel. So we're going to continue this assignment by completing the tints of blue and the shades of red. So the tints of blue are a value scale, and the shades of red are a value scale. And so that these boxes are going to be very similar to the value scales that you did when drawing with graphite. The idea is that you're demonstrating value range by having a light, a medium light, a medium dark, and a dark. That's what we want to see across here, but that will be created using a combination of blue and white. The shades of red is going to be the same thing, except for it's going to be a combination of red and black, with the lightest color down here gradually working its way to dark. Okay, but we're going to start with the tints of blue. So what you need to understand about a tint of blue is it has to be blue. So the first color is not going to be solid white, because that has no blue in it, therefore it would not be a tint of blue. So we need to start with a very light blue color. So I'm going to start with a significant portion of white, and then I'm going to get a very small amount of blue. Mix it into that white. You want this color to be very light, but there's plenty of value range to work with when it comes to the tints of blue, so you don't have to worry too much. It doesn't need to be really pale. You should be able to clearly tell that it is blue. You don't want to get so light that it almost looks like white. It should be very obvious what the color is, okay? So this lightest color that I've mixed up is going to go right down here at the beginning of the scale as my lightest tint of blue. Okay, so now I have my lightest blue. So now I just need to get a little bit darker. Now, a common mistake when it comes to the tints of blue is that people don't make enough change from each color. And so what ends up happening is I have 4 very light blues and then a sudden leap because the last color in the spectrum is going to be solid regular blue with no white in it. And so you've got 3 steps to get here. So if you don't change enough between each steps, then the change from the 4th one to the 5th one is going to be very dramatic. So please keep that in mind. Okay, now I've got my second color here. So same process is going to repeat again. So I'm just going to add a bit more blue again, stir it into my existing color. And now I can apply medium blue. Now, notice that I'm being very careful. I'm painting along the edges first, around the outside of the box. And then I'm going into the inside and evening it out. Just like with the color wheel up here, craftsmanship and neatness is a factor, so make sure you're not painting sloppily. I want to see clear, distinct, square boxes. A little trick too, while you're mixing your colors, if you hold your brush next to the other color without touching it, you can see how much difference is there, and that should give you a good indication of whether it's gotten dark enough. Then finally, we've got the last box here, which is solid blue. Now, I have white in my brush. No matter how much blue I add to it, I'm still going to have white in my brush. So I have to wash my brush out before I go any further. Okay, so now that my brush is clean and dry, I can go directly into solid blue and apply that into this last box. Okay, the final stage of this process is going to be making the shades of red value scale. Now I've got some red left over, but it's not a lot, and there's some other colors mixed in. So just to ensure that that doesn't get messed up, I'm going to just get myself a little bit of fresh red and some black. Now, you don't need much black at all. This black will go a long way, so get a very small amount. Okay, so just like with the tints of blue, where the last one was solid blue, in this one, because red is the lighter color, the first one is going to be solid red, no black. Okay, so now I've gotten my red block finished. So now I need to make the medium light value by adding a very, very small amount of black. Remember we talked about blue being overpowering? Well, black is going to be the most overpowering of these paints. And even the tiniest amount of black is going to have a dramatic impact on that red. So I have to be very careful and only add a little small amount and mix it into lots of red. You may notice when you're mixing this that it looks a little bit like red-violet. That's normal. It's just the nature of the way these colors look that it does bear some similarities, but that will change as you get further along. The tints of blue is probably the easiest part of this entire process. The shades of red, by contrast, are probably the most difficult because both colors are very dark and it can be tricky to get a broad value range if you're not really careful and making sure that you don't get too dark too fast. You don't want the last 2 or 3 to look the same. Okay, so I've got my second color now for the medium red. So for that, same thing. I've already got some color mixed up. I'm just going to add just a tiny bit more black, mix it in. Again, you want the change to be slow, so be very careful. Don't go too dark too fast. You've got to get 2 more or 3 more values in here, and they need to each look different. So you got to be real careful or you end up with several that look the same. Okay, so now I've got my medium color. Now I'm going to the medium dark. Okay, so now I've just got one color left, which is the dark. Now, bear in mind that this shouldn't be solid black. That's because just like with the lightest blue, white would not be a tint of blue, so black would not be a shade of red. It has to have red in it for it to be considered a shade of red. So I still have to make sure that I have red in it, but it should be fairly dark. So you need a pretty reasonable amount of black, just not so much that you can't tell that it's got some red in it. And there you have it, a completed shades of red value scale. So, and that brings to a completion the entire color wheel. This is a process that you might have to practice. If it didn't come out right the first time, try it again. The more you do this, the better you're going to get at it. And a lot of times, don't get discouraged if it didn't come out right the first time. It takes practice, and you may have to do 2 or 3 of these before you get really good results, and that's okay, because every time you practice, you're going to get a little bit better. Most important thing is just be careful, pace yourself, mix your colors carefully, and don't rush. And if you make a mistake in mixing your colors, fix it before you put it on here, not after, because once it's on here, it's permanent. So you can save yourself some trouble and time of having to redo things if you can make sure you get the colors right to begin with before putting it on here. So if you know you mixed it wrong, just mix it again. Start fresh. New paint if necessary. Have a good day.